The Quartermain mansion had survived every kind of storm the family could conjure: boardroom coups staged across the breakfast table, awkward charity galas that doubled as ambushes, and wars waged through legal briefs slid across polished wood. But nothing prepared those glossy floors for the afternoon Ronnie detonated the calm with a teacup. She arrived a shade too bright, a half-smile pinned to her face like a brooch that didn't quite match, drifting among guests and portraits while the steam from her cup curled upward like a signal flare. The tea had been tampered with, that much would only be clear later, but in the moment, all anyone saw was the fuse catching. A quiver at the corner of her mouth. A sudden tilt in her voice. And then, as if daring the room to blink, she set decorum ablaze. Across the coffee table, Tracy held herself with the iron posture of a woman who had chaired too many committees to be frightened by an upstart. The table between them, curated with understated menace, held glossy magazines, a sugar bowl, and a sweating pitcher that threw diamonds of condensation across the lacquer. Tracy's threat was not the kind that needed volume. It lived in a raised eyebrow and a fractional shift of weight that said she could weaponize anything at hand, water included. Ronnie met that look and refused to bend. There was history here, not of long seasons but of a few sharp days in which Tracy had made it her personal crusade to show that Ronnie was a glitch in the family's program. The argument teetered from brittle politeness into spectacle, the way string snaps right before anyone hears it fray. Gasps rose like birds startled from hedges when Ronnie, vibrating with insult and chemically nudged courage, marched to the threshold and banished Tracy from her own ancestral stage. The shock rolled through the room in eddies. Guests pretended to straighten napkins or consult their phones, anything to avoid choosing a side too soon. Somewhere behind the silk of Tracy's blouse, a blade of satisfaction slipped free. Marco Rios had done precisely what she needed, nudged the right whispers into the right ears, pointed the right eyes at the right behaviors, so that Ronnie appeared volatile and, therefore, removable. Tracy had not always needed a conspirator, she was capable of solitary maneuver. But this was a moment requiring finesse rather than thunder, and Marco's talent for arranging perceptions had been well used. Monica's wishes, ever the moral horizon, would need to be skirted, not shattered. If Ronnie could be made into a problem everyone agreed they could no longer host, Tracy could claim she was merely responding to consensus. The pitcher, never appended, still sweated under the light, as if the house itself had taken a breath and decided to hold it. The pressure brewing inside the mansion found an echo in the hospital lobby, where the fluorescent hush carried its own brand of judgment. Portia felt every footstep like a second heartbeat as she paced out the perimeter of a decision she hadn't yet admitted aloud. Jordan read her in an instant, the protective tilt of her shoulders, the way she guarded her midsection as if shielding a confession. Jordan had learned to trust patterns more than promises, and the pattern here was unmistakable, expectation threaded through with worry. She tried to keep the discovery small, seal it between two professionals who had seen enough secrets turn to shrapnel. But the knowledge warmed her words, and Portia, already braced for impact, asked for distance rather than shelter. Jordan backed off publicly and stored the truth privately, promising herself she would not tell Curtis even as she felt the shape of the decision pressing at the edges of her restraint. Afterward, the gravity of Portia's situation bent another orbit. Jordan, carrying too many truths at once, sought out Anna Devane and let the frustration spill. Not a full inventory. Names and deeds weren't hers to reveal, but a contour map of resentment. She respected Curtis enough to resent anyone who might steer him with half-honesty, and the decades-long fog over Trina's paternity sharpened her disappointment. In Jordan's mind, a family could survive nearly any blow except the slow leak of the truth. Watching another lie germinate felt like history refusing to end. Portia did not have the luxury of Jordan's clarity. Her body had become a vessel for two hypotheticals, and each carried its own past. Curtis was steadiness, the man who had insisted the world could be rebuilt one apology at a time. Isaiah was a rupture, a shock of lightning that had illuminated too much at once. Portia stood at the fault line where medicine and memory collided. Until a lab settled the matter, she would have only her conscience to navigate by. She took refuge in Isaiah's presence not because it simplified anything but because he listened without weighing her soul on a scale. She didn't name the child or the father, Isaiah didn't ask her to. He sat with the uncertainty as if it were a patient in need of observation rather than a sin requiring penance. In that quiet, Portia realized that secrecy was not the same as lying, but neither could it be a home. Across town, Trina measured the distance between toughness and faith. To Jocelyn, she confided the heaviest truth she could bear without felling herself, the exterminated evidence, the pathway it burned through her parents' marriage, the ash that refused to be swept away. She wanted to restore what she'd helped break, but reconciliation, she knew, wasn't a bouquet you could deliver with an apology card. It was a geometry problem in which angles must be proven, not assumed. Divorce papers turned parents into topography, mountains you must go around rather than through. She tried to imagine a future in which a baby could be both a blessing and a bridge, but bridges needed bedrock, and right now, the ground kept slipping. Curtis, living under the same sky as all these dominoes and refusing to watch them fall in silence, chose to absorb a hit that might no longer matter and yet mattered a great deal, Kai Taylor's apology. It arrived without ornament, as unadorned as a confession can be when it travels a long way to reach the right doorstep. Kai had believed a story spun by Drew Kane and, in that belief, had acted in ways that lacerated people who had never wronged him. The thing about betrayal, Curtis thought as he listened, is that it often starts as misdirected trust. Kai could not repair the marriage that had fractured under heavier weights than his choices, but remorse has its own physics. When someone brings it to you in both hands, you either take it or you add yourself to the list of people too proud to let the future be marginally less damaged than the past. Drew, meanwhile, twined justice and leverage into a single rope and presented it to Alexis Davis. He knew the contours of persuasion, a problem cast as a moral necessity made even the most skeptical listener lean forward. Willow's defense required more than a competent attorney, it required someone who understood how public narrative could scaffold a courtroom argument. Alexis was that person, the legal mind who could argue a case and the editorial nerve who could teach a city what to believe. But Drew also understood that goodwill did not grow on barren soil. There was the restraining order, a thorny hedge around Scout that had kept Alexis, Christina, Molly, Danny, and Rocco on the far side of love. Drew placed the possibility of a gate on the table. Partial relief. Conditional access. A way to translate legal enmity back into familial grammar if Alexis would take up Willow's cause. Not a bribe, he told himself. A trade that left everyone a little less wrong. Hesitation was Alexis's specialty when the stakes involved both the law and the heart. She had been the architect of too many careful arguments to pretend that impulse was a virtue. Willow presented as a case with a pulse, a woman who might be guilty, who might be framed, who might be something in between that the law had never known how to classify properly. The city did not reward nuance, headlines corralled the complicated into bite-sized villains and saints. Alexis paced the ridge between prudence and compassion and finally acknowledged what the ridge gave her, a view of both sides. If she were to help, it would be on terms that did not launder doubt into certainty. She would test Drew's offer for structural soundness and insist that any path to Scout pass through the gates of responsibility and safety. In the periphery, Lulu Spencer watched the story taking shape like a headline trying to write itself. She knew what public sympathy could do when aimed at the right target at the right time. She also knew the danger of using the press as a scalpel, it cuts clean until it slips. Part of her wanted to lift Willow's face above the fray, remind the city that accusations can be fashion and that truth lags the season. Lucas Jones served as her ballast, the cautious voice that counted costs. To him, advocacy without certainty felt like inviting the town to tamper with evidence. If Willow had shot Drew, then all this compassion would become a cudgel used against the wounded. Lulu heard him and still felt the tug of responsibility that lives inside reporters when the institutions they cover fail to meet the moment. She would move carefully, she promised herself, which is what ambitious people vow right before they move boldly. Back at the mansion, the aftermath of Ronnie's eruption revealed the house's true architecture, hallways built for gossip, corners designed to catch confidences, stairwells that echoed names. Guests recalibrated their alliances in whispers. Some tooted about propriety, others thrilled at the spectacle and texted friends who had declined their invitations, seasoned with a pinch of regret that they hadn't filmed the climax. In the quiet that followed, the facts became malleable. Had Tracy truly been menaced? Had Ronnie threatened or simply defended herself against an ambush of insinuation? The beauty of chaos, Tracy understood, is that it can be shepherded. She would not need to rewrite the afternoon, she only had to underline it in the right ink until everyone saw what she wanted them to see, instability that justified removal. What nobody in that room could see, what even Tracy could not anticipate, was how quickly a doctored cup can become an origin story. If the tea had loosened Ronnie's tongue, it had also loosened the lid over a larger container. The Quartermain mansion had long traded in controlled detonations, sell a division here, marry a rival there, pretend a scandal is a strategic pivot. But chemical chaos laughs at choreography. If someone had set Ronnie up, that someone had reduced the family's prized asset, control, to a gossip item. And when control leaves a house, it rarely leaves alone. It drags money and reputation down the stairs behind it, every step a thud. Jordan and Anna, each in her lane, marked the day in their ledgers. Portia carried a secret that would either redeem or ruin multiple lives. Curtis held an apology that might one day become forgiveness. Trina guarded a truth that made her brave but could cost her what remained of her home. Kai learned the quiet discipline of contrition. Drew sharpened a bargain into something he could convince himself was benevolence. Alexis weighed a case in the court of her conscience before it ever reached a judge. Lulu hovered over a story she might set loose upon the world. Lucas anchored the moral calculus with a simple question: what if the worst thing is also the true thing? By evening, the mansion had settled into a performance of normal, the way a stage looks after the curtain drops, all velvet and hush. Staff mopped away the last of the afternoon's footprints. The pitcher was returned to the kitchen and refilled, as if it had never glistened under the threat of becoming a weapon. Tracy retreated to a private room to review messages that praised her composure or decried her cruelty, each note a mirror for the sender rather than for her. Ronnie, somewhere else in the city, tried to drain the day from her bloodstream and found it pulsing anyway, a metronome to which her anger tapped its relentless beat. She told herself she would not be defined by a cup of tea or by the woman who nearly hurled water like a verdict. Yet definitions have a way of creeping in through the windows you forget to lock. And floating above all these intersecting paths was the simplest of narrative questions, the one that soaps and real lives borrow from each other with equal greed: what changes first, the truth, or what people believe? If Portia's child belonged to Curtis, a door might swing open in a wall that had looked permanent. If the child was Isaiah's, a different map would be needed, one in which friendship, co-parenting, or separation were not failures but new forms of courage. If Alexis took Drew's offer and found the spine of Willow's defense, the city might learn to hold multiple ideas at once, that a victim can also be a suspect, that mercy and justice are not opposite teams. If Lulu lit the fuse of public sympathy and Lucas's warnings proved prophetic, the blowback would salt the earth for the next person who needed a fair hearing. For now, the pieces refused to declare themselves. Which is its own kind of drama, the suspended moment before events crash into conclusions. The Quartermains would meet and maneuver. Jordan would keep a confidence that pressed against her ribs. Anna would measure when to intervene and when to let the lesson teach itself. Portia would listen for the sound of resolve underneath the static of fear. Curtis would practice the daily endurance of doing the right thing without applause. Trina would decide how much truth she could carry without breaking. Kai would set his apology on the table again tomorrow, and the day after that, until time decided what to do with it. Drew would continue to insist that deals can be ethical if they save the right people. Alexis would draft arguments in the air above her desk until one of them landed with the weight of conviction. Lulu would sharpen her questions. Lucas would keep his answers steady. And the mansion, which had seen worse and would certainly see worse again, would pretend that nothing had happened. It would gleam. It would host. It would open its doors to a city that loves pageantry as long as someone else pays for the cleanup. But under the shine, the day's fault lines would continue their quiet arithmetic, extending, intersecting, calculating where to deliver the next shock. Because that is how these stories move forward, not in a straight line but in pulses. A cup. A threat. A banishment. A secret. An apology. A bargain. A headline unwritten. Each element seems small, almost private, until it collides with the others and becomes the weather everyone must live in.